that. But I mean, it's a very interesting time here in the UK to be raising questions about 0.7%. And, you know, these questions have to be asked. And I'm looking forward to hearing Andrew's reflections on some of this. But I think, you know, there's a very, very legitimate question on the table here, which is in a world of increasing hyper-collective action. That's a very nice concept that you've described. You know, do we need to be thinking differently about the development financing system and the means by which we measure and deliver around the whole global public policy agenda? Andrew, you've got an opportunity to reflect on some of those
Thank you very much indeed. Jean-Michel, Olivier, thank you. That was brilliant. And I would encourage everybody here to read the paper. It is worth investing an hour or two in this paper. It's exciting, it's important, and typical for Jean-Michel, it's also flirting with danger. I should say that, you know, the developing business, the business of development has some great leaders of institutions and has some great thinkers, but not often do you get that in the same person. And Jean-Michel is a thinker as well as running Agence Française for Development. And AFD is a great partner for DFID. Today we signed an MOU. Minouche and Jean-Michel signed an MOU talking about how we're going to work even more closely. So,
but not about suppressing ODA.
No. I should also say, not only was Jean-Michel my colleague before, but for a couple of years he was also my boss. So this is actually payback time. So let me tell you why. The first sentence, by the way, of this paper reads, "Official development assistance is dying." Then goes on to say, "Our current understanding of ODA is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The measurement of ODA is senseless." So there's good grist here for my comments. Let me first tell you why I like this paper a lot. 5 points. First, development finance has changed exactly in the 3 ways that Jean-Michel and Olivier capture. Our objectives have expanded to include global public goods. The sources of funding have multiplied, and the instruments have become much richer. And combined, these have made our business much more exciting than ever before. So I agree with that. I would actually, my second point would be, I'd actually add a fourth thing that's changed, and that is our partner countries have changed beyond measure. I mean, I lived in East Asia in the early 1980s. I lived there again throughout the 1990s and until 2 years ago. I mean, it's a different world out there. And the concept of assistance, you know, is something that we need to move on from. And what we are seeing now currently in Africa is, I don't know what you'd call it, sort of the East Asianization of Africa in terms of increased sophistication of our partners. And so absolutely right, we need to think of a new way moving forward. Third, I agree the definition of ODA needs some tidying up. The fact that to qualify for ODA, the grant element needs only to be 25%, and that is with a 10% discount rate. I spoke to Richard Manning yesterday, you know, the ex-head of DAC, and he said most of the mortgages that you have in this room would qualify the bankers as providing assistance to you by that definition. So yes, obviously, it should measure the grant element only. And it's a great joy to work in a country where ODA in Britain is grant. It's not loans. And so to the extent that we want to change it, that's an area My fourth point is we need to do a much better job measuring other flows. And I think Jean-Michel and Olivier, in a really brilliant way, have demonstrated that. You know, whether it's non-DAC donors, whether it's private, voluntary flows, whether it's foundations. Fifth, I agree that we need to be much, much better at measuring results and linking our money to those results. Now, we've got some resistance on this. I mean, last year, the European Union had something called an agenda for action. And we worked extremely hard to get exactly this. So in other words, we, the Europeans who provide 60% of ODA, we are going to commit to delivering this kind of development in education, in health, and so on. Put real deliverables, and then put the money in as well, exactly along the lines that Jean-Michel and Olivier have been arguing for. But we got quite a lot of pushback. In fact, we got overwhelming pushback. We got it in last year, but it'd be harder to get it in this year. Why? Because countries are backing off the commitments they made. So that's what I like about it. Now, just a couple of points where I disagree. The main point of the paper is that the world has changed and become so much more complex that the notion of ODA is irrelevant, and we should change it. We should expand it. We should shrink it. We should create a new indicator. And I just want to go through briefly the three big changes and see whether they actually imply that. So first, argument number one is because we have new objectives. Now, in the paper, there's a really good distinction between three conceptual reasons for providing assistance. One is for growth and transformation. One is essentially to promote human welfare and address inequalities. And third is global public goods. I agree fully that when it comes to global public goods, carbon financing, and so on, we need to somehow ring-fence that from ODA, and that we need to maybe increase ODA to 1% of GDP or something like that. And that's exactly what Prime Minister Gordon Brown has been trying to do. I don't agree that with regard to the first two, there is the distinction that's quite as strong as you're making. The argument that Jean-Michel is making is that we used to do growth, now we do a lot of essentially welfare. You know, that's education, health, social protection. My view would be that's a useful conceptual distinction, but actually trying to distinguish that in practice is not useful, because most of what we do under education or health or water supply or social protection is actually transformative. It is very much, it comes out not only because, as you say, the private sector and charities got involved, it comes out in an intellectual process where we all realize that building roads is not what's going to give you sustainable growth. You need precisely to do the education, the health, the social protection in order to get that. So I don't find that distinction as helpful practically. Nancy Birdsall and others at the Centre for Global Development have made this same point, and I think it's useful conceptually for us to think through, but I'm not certain it is useful practically. The second line of argument is that new players, because there are so many new players, it's exciting, there are many more, absolutely these should be measured. That's not the same, though, as arguing that you shouldn't measure what a government gives, which is what ODA is all about. So yes, we should measure what non-DAC donors do. We should, and the UN needs to do a much better job of that. We also need much more systematic measures of private giving. At the moment, you can't figure out these numbers unless you turn to the Hudson Institute, which is a good institute, but it has its own ideological biases with regard to why, for heaven's sake, do we not have better measures of that? That's absolutely right. But again, it's different from saying you should stop measuring what governments spend. Similarly, voluntary contributions, foundations, and corporate giving, yes, we should do. But just because we do a poor job at measuring what the others do doesn't mean we shouldn't measure what comes from government, nor should we stop holding our governments to account. Now, the third set of arguments is that because we have so many new instruments, it's all much more complicated. And as Jean-Michel said, you know, some of the more financial instruments like advanced market commitments, PDPs, product development partnerships, which is when we put some money in alongside a private drug company to develop a new drug for neglected tropical diseases, like the IFIM. Now, because of they're so complicated, they're public-private, the argument is we should stop measuring the public in the same way we do. I would say no, actually. The way we do things in DFID or the UK, we get a pot of money. Currently, it's half of 1% of GDP. We can spend that grant either on doing a bilateral program for water supply in Zambia or putting some money alongside a private company that's developing a new drug in the United States. Both need to be judged by the development impact. Both are on the books. Both are part of ODA. And that's the same for IFIM. It's the same for AMCs and so on. The paper then goes on to talk about what they call old school aid. And I think they capture extremely well the transitions. Old school aid is focusing on projects. New school aid is focusing on programs. I agree with that. But I don't think in and of itself it has anything to do with the definition of ODA. Second, old school aid focuses only on investment and is not willing to finance recurrent costs. New school aid is willing to finance recurrent costs. That's absolutely true. I mean, DFID now would fund a lot of recurrent costs for teachers and so on. In the old days, we would have just been building the school. I agree with that, but in and of itself, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the definition of ODA. Third, old school aid channels money to government And government-to-government aid, the paper says, is what's called a double monopoly, which sounds bad, doesn't it? But actually, this is not old school aid. This is actually new school aid. I mean, in the old days, we used to put our money through NGOs. We used to do it like USAID does it today. They wouldn't go close to financing, putting money through a government. Often, we would use British experts to go in and so on. The new approach that Paris and Accra has brought us is trusting and building the capacity of government. So double monopoly makes it sound like we're sort of doing something really evil here. In fact, this is new aid, but it doesn't really have much to do with the definition of ODA. So I guess then the 3 points about the changing landscape are absolutely right, and I've never seen a better description of those anywhere. But whether or not they imply that we should throw away ODA in a dramatic way, I don't quite get that. Now, coming on to the ODA definition, there's some really interesting stuff here about it measures, as Jean-Michel was saying, too much, too little, and the wrong things. Too much, the example of scholarships, and there's a great story in the paper about someone coming to the United Kingdom and working in the City of London and the UK claiming that on their ODA. But actually, the whole point is we don't provide scholarships precisely for the reason that you say, because we actually don't think it's very good for development. Let's focus on what's good for development. I'd be quite happy to change the definition, but I think our friends in Australia, who have played a huge role in providing education at the university level for people from Vietnam who are now back there making a big difference, I think they would legitimately say, wait a minute, but anyway, I don't want to argue that case. First year of refugees, you're quite right, that's why we don't claim the first year of refugees here. Too little, so ODA covers too much, but it also covers too little. Non-DAC donors, yeah, I agree, we should absolutely measure non-DAC donors. Tax relief. Actually, gift aid in the United Kingdom is about £50 million a year. That is the tax relief. That can be counted as ODA. Certainly, if you think, roughly speaking, probably private flows, charitable flows to developing countries, about $50 billion a year, maybe, I don't know, $50 billion. Let's assume 1/3 of that, or 1/2 of that applies for tax relief. 1/3 debt, something like $8 billion a year would be added. So I think it's definitely a point worth looking at. That it seems to me to be a good point. I think on the ODA definition, we would be very nervous now doing some of the things that are recommended here. So, for example, on the private sector, there's some hints here that we ought to be extending this for equity investments to developing countries. I would be very nervous about that. I think your point on guarantees is absolutely right, by the way. So the proposal of the paper is to ditch ODA and replace it with GPF. I think the idea of GPF is really interesting. That's global policy funding. I do think it would be extremely good to include all flows, try to capture results, and distinguish the different purposes of aid, which is what the paper suggests. But I would not, and by the way, there are some interesting measures trying to do that. Read the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which the Gates Fund. They do a very interesting report, the Development Assistance for Health, where they try and do some of that. And I think that would be really good. And I think it's even a good idea to add them up. But here's the point. Don't add them up if the implication is that there is strong substitutability among them. So, for example, there's a great table in the paper, which is a really nice one, which shows all the different actors, and it suggests you add up what private sector invests in a country with official development assistance. That's fine to add that up, but not if you think as a result of that you can lower your development assistance. So this is precisely where the danger comes in, because there's a great statement here in the paper that says we will show the fact that this benchmark measure, official development assistance, the fact that it is senseless helps explain why the targets are not reached. In other words, it's because we have a lousy definition, you can't blame our politicians for not achieving the targets. And I say, no, that's not the reason they're failing to do it. It's not because they're all thinking, oh, if only we had a better definition, we would be up to 0.7. No, these guys have brilliant assistants, brilliant advisors. They knew exactly what they're doing when they signed up to it. And Bob Geldof and Bono are absolutely right to hold politicians accountable for what they promised. The definition was crystal clear. Now, should it be changed over time? Absolutely. And I think the broad direction of change proposed by this paper is right. Should it be changed now, halfway through? Absolutely not, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Audrey.